Hello, everyone. My name is Kobus van Staden, and I'd like to welcome you to the Global Research Alliance for Sustainable Finance and Investment Conference for 2021, and especially to the fireside chat today about sovereign debt and how we're going to finance the post-COVID-19 recovery. So this is such a key issue at the moment, particularly in my neighborhood, which is in Johannesburg in South Africa, where the economic crisis relating to COVID-19 has in lots of ways become more of a crisis than the health crisis, even though that is a massive crisis as well. South Africa has really suffered over the last few months from increasing political tensions that have a direct link to lapses in the social safety net exposed by the COVID-19 pandemic, and particularly also financial crises around reconstruction and particularly also how they impact on larger development agendas. So this is a massive issue and one that needs creative unpacking. And we have a few better people to help unpack us than our two kind of main guests today. Balázs Horváth is a chief economist for Asia Pacific at the United Nations Development Programme. He led the drafting teams producing flagship reports in the region, notably on the social and economic impact of COVID-19 in the Asia Pacific region, addressing this impact through social protection and on economic aspects of climate change. He also led the production and the production with distinguished Chinese counterparts of flagship reports in China on harmonizing investment and financing standards and on low carbon development. Prior to this, he worked as director of UNDP's Seoul Policy Center, UNDP country director in South Sudan, and in various other capacities in the UNDP and at the International Monetary Fund. He is Hungarian and he holds a PhD in economics from the University of Pennsylvania. Our second guest is Hannah Wanjiya-Ryder. She's the CEO of Development Reimagined, a pioneering African-owned international development consultancy with headquarters in China and offices in Kenya and in the UK. As a private sector firm with a mission for sustainable development and poverty reduction, her firm provides strategic advice and practical support to African, Chinese, and international clients on issues ranging from debt financing, the Belt and Road Initiative, to Africa's growth markets, green growth, and China's foreign aid. A former diplomat and economist with close to 20 years of experience, she's also a senior associate at the Washington, D.C.-based Center for Strategic and International Studies, and a member of the UAE's International Advisory Council on the New Economy. She also plays various advisory roles for the United Nations, was a co-author of the 2006 Stern Review, and helped design and negotiate the $100 billion climate finance commitment written into climate accords. Hannah is the recipient of numerous awards, was featured in FT, and is also a sought-after speaker and writer. So we are incredibly honored to have both of these speakers with us today, and I want to kick off by asking something a very basic question, and I'd like both of you to just kind of start us off by responding to that. What is the difference between pre-COVID and our current situation? Like, what are some of the biggest changes that you've seen due to the pandemic and its related crises, and particularly if we focus on the issue of sovereign debt and the financing for reconstruction? Like, how has that landscape changed? Maybe we should start with Hannah, and then Balázs can jump in after.
Thank you, Kobus, for the kind introduction, and it's wonderful to be here. Thank you so much to the organizers for inviting me to join this this fireside chat. It's very nice. So you asked a question, Kobus, what has changed? And of course, there's a lot that has changed since COVID-19, not least our lives, but also in the fiscal situation of many countries. We're talking about sovereign debt. If you look at Asia Pacific, on average in 2020, Asia Pacific countries spent about 7% of GDP on the response. That's UNESCAP figures. On average, African countries spent 2.5% of GDP on the COVID-19 response, both health responses and also economic responses. So this is significant, a big, significant new spend. And sadly, it is continuing into 2021 and does not look like it will necessarily end in 2022. Beyond that, of course, we also have declining economic growth, or declining in comparison to what was projected. Prior to COVID-19, we had growth in some African countries that was certainly over 4%, etc. Same in Asia Pacific. However, now those projections are significantly different and significantly less, and especially with those countries that are not haven't got enough vaccines. They're unable to at least try to pick up as much as other countries are in terms of economic activity. Or simply, people will face massive risks as they do so. So there's a lot that has changed. But what hasn't changed is that prior to COVID-19, there was already a narrative which was building that especially African countries are in some sort of debt crisis. Whether or not this is true, and we will come to this, I think, hopefully in our discussion, is a matter of analysis and dispute. And I say that because prior to COVID-19, there were 64 countries globally with public debt over thresholds of 60% of GDP, which is the kind of typical threshold that people think is a kind of challenge in terms of debt carrying capacity. A third of those were African. So this is not a specific African issue in terms of having a certain level of debt in the economy. However, there's a number of African countries, and in fact, all of the only 12 countries in the 64 countries, in that group of 64 countries that had public debt thresholds over 60% that were classified as debt distressed, were African. So it seems that debt crisis idea was very much implying that there was a debt crisis in Africa prior to COVID-19. And so since COVID-19, because there's been extra spend, even though that spend has been much smaller with fiscal constraints than many other countries, there's still an increasing concern that there is a new debt crisis and a bigger debt crisis building up. So we need to look into history to really understand this. We need to look into what are the real fiscal constraints that countries are facing. And we need to understand what are the options for moving forward, whether or not there is a debt crisis. What is clear, certainly, and from the 2020 experience, is that the poorest countries have the least resources, whether it's vaccines or money, to deal with COVID-19. And that is a global problem. And we still, in 2021, still haven't got to grips with that, still haven't found the right solutions. So I think that would be what I would say has changed and not changed since COVID-19. And yeah, looking forward to discussing much more.
Balázs, why don't you go ahead with the same question?
Let me just say that I don't like the expression post-COVID as applied to today's situation. We are certainly beyond the first acute wave of COVID, but unfortunately, I don't think any one of us can state with confidence that we are post-COVID. And we are not likely to be for some time. And that connects directly to what Hannah said. I think that's a very important point. As for pre-COVID, I think the key aspect, certainly from the point of view of UNDP, is that this has, pre-COVID, the world economy and most countries have been on an unsustainable path. They have been on an unsustainable path, most certainly from the point of view of climate change, but in various other ways. And I'd like to bring in the three pillars of sustainability. When we talk about the social pillar, there has been rapid rise in inequality. And while there is a range of inequality where this does not undermine social peace, there has been a movement towards some kind of threshold, but that not one of us can foretell where exactly it is. But beyond that threshold, there is much less adherence to the social contract, and there are very big problems. Similarly, on the environmental side, we had climate change, we have biodiversity loss, we have the need for a low carbon transition. But of course, today's topic is mainly on the economic side. And I think that distress, and to be more precise, that service distress, is a central topic for tonight. And I think it is very important to note that all the things that Hannah said, both in individual countries and continents, but I think globally, there has been a very rapid increase in fiscal deficits, and as those were financed, into debt stock. And that happened in a certain context. The context was incredibly loose monetary policy worldwide. Fiscal, of course, was loose because there was a need to react to both the immediate health crisis, but also the sort of slower moving but equally serious economic crisis. And in that context, there have been very low interest rates, so much larger debt stocks have been possible to build up without debt service actually going through the roof. But this is the context we have today, and that creates a lot of vulnerabilities. Let me just stop here, and we can go on to discussing debt, sovereign debt itself. Over to you.
So, like, as Hannah pointed out, the conversation about data stress is itself, to a certain extent, it's ideologically inflicted, or the framing of data stress itself is, isn't without its complications. So within that kind of understanding, I wonder what both of you, what you made of the G20's DSSI, the Debt Servicing Suspension Initiative, and then as it kind of segued into the common framework. What like as you saw it, kind of unfolding over the last year and a half or so, kind of what have been your kind of shifting perceptions around that? Hannah, why don't we start with you, and then Balázs, I'd love to get your input on that as well. Before you start, I just want to say to our audience that we would love to include your questions to the speakers. So please feel free to post them on the platform where you're watching, and then they will be conveyed to us, and we'll communicate them to the speakers. So please go ahead with that. Thanks, Hannah. Hannah, go ahead.
So I think much like vaccine access, unfortunately, I think the debt service initiative sounded good in principle, but has been a disappointment. Especially for the poorest countries. And I say that because, first of all, multilaterals were not involved, or rather they did not sign up to also relax debt payments requirements. The private sector did not join in. It was just bilaterals. And those bilaterals, including China, have a record of debt relief. They are dealing with it, they're doing their best, but leaving out the other players, which is effectively about 60% of debt of African countries, was, I think, a huge mistake and really unfortunate. And I think it has serious repercussions on fiscal space. What has happened since then is the new issuance of special drawing rights from the IMF, which again, another initiative with a lot of promise, $650 billion US But again, when you go to the detail, when you come down to the nitty-gritty and the reality of implementation, very few countries really benefit significantly from that. There's a few countries that get the vast majority of those because they are allocated on a specific formula. And there was not a decision, a concurrent decision by the IMF member states to allocate using a different formula, which they could have been, but they hasn't been as yet. So as a result, that means, for instance, African countries get 33 billion US dollars out of 650 billion, which is, it will make a difference. It will make a difference, but at the margin. And actually, what's really required, if you look at what that estimate is, if you look at what 30 billion represents, that is the estimate that has been made of annual financing costs required to deal with climate change. A problem which African countries hardly contribute to, 4%, less than 4% of global emissions. So many initiatives look great. So many initiatives, you know, we have non-governmental organizations really putting their weight behind and so on. Governments putting their weight behind. But we have to really pay attention to the implementation. I think this is a key lesson learned going forwards, and we have to pay attention to that detail, because once you do look into it, there are significant challenges with the way that these schemes, which are meant to support the poorest countries, actually are delivered.
Balázs, like, what was your impression of these processes over the last while?
So first of all, there had to be a debt service suspension, one way or another. That was very, very clear, because countries already before the pandemic, several of them were at the brink of getting into serious debt distress. And then came the pandemic with the large fiscal deficits that it necessitated, and then that really pushed a lot of countries over the brink. And the way it was done really looked a lot like kicking the can down the road, because first it was only through the end of 2021, and in a sense the way it was structured, that it wasn't forgiven what was due in 2021, it was just moved to January 1, 2022. So in a sense it was slightly lower in 2021, and they created an artificial cliff from 2022. And then, of course, they came around to thinking about that as well. But all the problems Hannah has mentioned, they are very valid problems about which countries are eligible. And then I would just like to make a point that actually the set of countries that are facing serious risk of debt distress are not necessarily exactly the poorest countries. The poorest countries, of course, deserve most of the support, but there are a bunch of middle-income countries which are also facing support, and they are not eligible for DSSI. So there has to be a broader way of dealing with the forthcoming serious stress. And about actually the IMF did have a way of postponing debt service due to the IMF for some countries in 2021. So just to give them their due, they did put together a fund from which they could cover payment due in 2021, but of course it was nowhere near enough. When it comes to SDR allocations, actually the allocation itself could not be done in any other way. It's in the Articles of Agreement that any quota increase has to be done in a way that is proportional to quotas. But there could have been a complementary agreement that the rich countries basically agreed that to put it into a central fund from which the relief could be actually targeted towards those who really need it for debt servicing purposes. And that indeed has not happened. So it has to do with political will. It has to do with the game that countries play in this multiplayer setting, and they have not been able to come to an agreement on this particular aspect. I think it's important to note that the problem has not gone away. The can has been kicked down the road somewhat. But what we are facing is a situation where a number of aspects can create an immediate crisis. For example, it cannot go on forever that the monetary stance of the major central banks remain so accommodative. And we have seen the taper tantrum that occurred just at the mention of the possibility that the US would reverse the rate at which it was pumping money into the US system and by implication into the world. And that kind of tapering and actually reversal will happen in the coming years. Of course, nobody knows, unless you are a central banker. Nobody knows when exactly it will happen, but it cannot stay on. Negative real interest rates are creating their own set of problems. So once that happens, that can be a trigger for a very large set of problems for a large set of countries. A sudden stop on private capital flows, which actually happened, or several observers thought was happening at the beginning of the first wave of COVID. And then it sort of reversed itself. But that remains a possibility, specifically for some countries in Africa, but also in Asia. And that, again, can trigger serious problems. Let me just conclude with one more thought. There is no universally accepted, globally accepted restructuring mechanism that would encompass all the players that Hanna already mentioned, which is public sector or sovereign players, private sector players, and in the absence of this, and also traditional lenders and non-traditional ones like China. China does not like to restructure its debt in a way that is other than bilateral, just China vis-a-vis another country. So there are lots and lots of potential pitfalls in the road ahead. Over to you.
Just staying on the question of the DSSI negotiations for the moment, Hanna, is looking back at how things unfolded, and particularly as we also saw the kind of conflict between private creditors and bilateral creditors, and the complication of trying to decide who is who, like how to classify these different kinds of debt. Was there a way that particularly private creditors could have been pulled in more effectively that was missed? Or are we talking about having to develop new forms of new mechanisms to try and kind of like to deal with them as well? Particularly like as we saw in the Zambian crisis, you know, the complications of who gets classified as what kind of creditor is ends up kind of like really being a really key issue. So like having looked at all of this, kind of was there kind of an opportunity that was missed, or do we need some kind of like a new approach to pull in private creditors?
Well, so there's a good part of me that wonders why private creditors did not come up with their own kind of scheme in any case. I mean, when you look at individuals, when COVID-19 struck, many people were offered moratoriums in terms of their debt payments. Like actually, you know, as individuals, banks felt, you know, we need to extend and support. It's not clear to me why private creditors at the international level didn't feel the same, that it would actually be in their interest to avoid defaults, unless for some reason they want defaults, which doesn't really make sense either. So really, if it is simply about that the architecture doesn't have a good room for the private creditors to be in, well, that can be solved quite quickly. But I think there are some fundamental questions. And of course, we've had proposals from, for example, Vera Songway with the Economic Commission for Africa, who have come up with suggestions for a liquidity sustainability facility, which would, for instance, potentially use some of the special drawing rights if there was a means found to allocate some of those to it, to be able to compensate in the short term private sector creditors for taking some sort of moratorium or kind of buying up their debt actually into a more low interest vehicle. So there are ideas around, but there is an issue. There's clearly an issue around coordination, but there is also the fact that in any case, there are many countries that don't even have access to private finance. So what Balázs was saying, he's absolutely right. Middle-income countries have been accessing private finance more, have been able to access private sector finance much more than low-income countries are. Low-income countries are basically kind of stuck out of the system, completely left out of the system, don't have credit ratings. And so they rely on MDBs, and audience has just made this point. They rely on MDBs, they rely on bilateral creditors. They thankfully have more emerging markets to look for credit in order to grow. But so how do middle-income countries, how do they go forwards? I think one option, and there are so many different options, one that my firm has put forward is for borrowers to come together, whether it's middle income, low income, but borrowers to come together. We're constantly talking about how creditors should be in the same room with one borrower. When we're talking about Zambia, much of the talk right now with a new president is Zambia going to have a meeting with all of its creditors? Well, actually, I'm not sure that's the right thing. I think it's more important for Zambia to have a meeting with other borrowers to find out how they're doing, how are they dealing with these sorts of issues, coordinate in that way. Because why are interest rates the level that they are? Are borrowers having these similar problems? Low-income countries are having the same problems, being cut out of, as we've just said, being cut out of the financial system, private sector system. These are problems that borrowers can work together to try to tackle, and perhaps that's what they should be doing more. That's what the reimagining is all about.
Balázs, and of course, Hannah, feel free to jump in at any time if you want. Balázs, so the audience, we gotten a question from the audience, and it's something that I was actually wondering about as well, is are we seeing kind of moves to set up mechanisms that the audience member mentioned a possible inclusive international working group to deal with all of the failures in the transnational system that we saw during COVID? I mean, in lots of ways, COVID was kind of a stress test, I think, for the international system to test how we're going to be dealing with these kind of like incredibly complex, kind of problems like climate change that come at us from many different kind of directions at once. In that sense, the COVID seems to have exposed a real lot of lapses, I think, in the international system. And from your position within the UN, I was wondering, kind of like, are you seeing kind of moves to set up more robust mechanisms, to overcome future challenges?
So let me first connect to a couple of things that Hannah has said, and then I promise I will get to this question because it is a very good question. So what I'd like to stress is that private creditors have not stepped in to the extent that others would have expected, first because they could. And there are two very important reasons why they could, and that will bring us to the solution that we actually have to address those underlying core reasons. The first one is the presence of very large amounts of guarantees. A guarantee is basically when a sovereign says that should you not be able to pay up, then we as the government step in and we will take the debt over and we will the debt service over and we will service it. So when it comes to a private sector borrower, it's very easy for them to say, oh no, okay, I can't pay, I will hand it over to the government. And the private sector creditor will know this and will be much more reluctant to accept a haircut, because it knows that because of the presence of government guarantees, it can be pushed over to become a sovereign debt. And that's actually a feedback loop in which sovereign debt can explode, it can escalate. The other reason is that you have to think, what exactly is the bulk of private sector debt? It is in the form of bonds. And bonds are very different kind of animals from a bilateral intergovernment law. Bonds have many, many, many different holders. So if a country takes $1 million, $100 million of bond debt, then it will be facing thousands and thousands of bondholders. And what happens is that the clauses, the small print in the bond contract, have allowed a strategy for certain private sector actors to be holdouts. Because they were written in a way that if one bondholder did not want to take a haircut and participate in a cooperative game of finding a solution with the borrower, then they could hold out and they could say, hey, I have a contract which says I want 100% of my loan. And very often they were actually paid off. They were said, okay, just get out of the way, we will pay you. And that has created adverse selection. It has created the wrong kinds of incentives. Not only that, there is a secondary market of bonds. And in the secondary market, a lot of players, when they smelled that there is going to be trouble for a country, they sold, often at very steep discounts compared to the face value. They sold off those loans. And there were vulture funds, which were private equity funds or privately owned funds, which basically bought up hundreds of millions of dollars of debt. This happened in Argentina, in Tanzania, in 20 some countries. They bought up debt at 20% of face value or something around that. And then they turned around and said, hey, I have a contract which says I want the full face value. And these vulture funds have really created huge problems. And now let me come to the solution. Governments need to be much more careful with how they extend government guarantees, because it's a way to hell for any budget. To think that I have this much debt that I need to worry about and therefore debt service, and then suddenly a lot of corporate debt is pushed on the government's balance sheet. And then suddenly they face 2-3 times as much debt service that they have, because a contingent liability has become an actual liability. And equally importantly, there are ways in which new bond issues can be written with a contract that actually says that there is a compulsory participation in a majority agreement to reschedule the debt. There are issues around it because it probably raises the actual cost of borrowing. However, when it comes to restructuring, then these holdouts cannot hold the trump card, and they cannot block potentially very large restructurings which could have helped in the past. There is a need for intercreditor equity. And this is where I would add to what Hanna said. Yes, I think it's a good idea if borrower countries get together, but there's no way around it. A country has to get together with all its creditors. It has to get together with the bondholders. It has to get together with the government, intergovernment lenders, and including China. China has its own way. And there needs to be a way in which a roughly equitable haircut is applied to all of them. And that has not happened in the past. How can that happen? You deal with the holdouts by having, for example, a legislative cap on how much you can pay out on bonds that were bought at a very steep discount. This is against vulture funds. And if that legislative cap is present in most countries, borrowing countries, then that strategy will no longer work. The same funds have basically used the international payment system to block payments of countries that were not willing to pay full face value for their portion of the bonds. And that can also be addressed. For example, Belgium has a rule that in the payment system that they have jurisdiction over, this cannot be done. Payments cannot be stopped even for the purpose of recovering that service if it is on a bond that has been bought at a deep discount. And bond contracts need to have this majority clause. These are some of the potential solutions that can be applied. I am sure I'm leaving out very important aspects that need to be added to it, but this is a beginning. And I think the principle of intercreditor equity is something that needs to be much more deeply sort of addressed. Just one last thought. There has been movement in this direction. For example, the DSSI, as flawed as it was the very first time that China actually participated in anything other than a bilateral restructuring of debt. China participated in the DSSI, and that was a multilateral approach. So there are steps which are pointing in the right direction, but obviously we still face a very high level of risk on debt distress. Over to you.
Hannah, obviously a lot of your work at Development Reimagined focuses on the relationship between China and the rest of the world, and also then the China takes on this kind of outside role in your focus on Africa as well, because it's a big trade partner, it's a big lender, and over the last year and a half it's also taken on this kind of outsized symbolic role in discussions around the successes and failures of debt crises kind of mitigation. So I was wondering if you could reflect a little bit on from your perspective, how has China's role in this looked? How did you interpret, for example, some of the controversies around the classification of certain kinds of Chinese debt, to debt distressed countries, to the insistence on China that it needs to resolve some of these crises bilaterally, and also the insistence coming from some Chinese actors on very high levels of anonymity or kind of secrecy around debt negotiations. Like what does that look like from your perspective?
Well, so I think, and I'm really curious about Balazs's point about how the creditors have to come around the table, because from a borrower's perspective, the fact is China has been a helpful creditor, both in terms of actually extending new finance, especially to countries that are left out of the international system. There are also a number of countries such as Zimbabwe or Sudan prior to a few months ago who couldn't get multilateral finance either. So China has been able to support them. So, and in addition to that, if you look at, for many countries, the actual amounts of debt relief over the same period as there was debt relief offered from other bilateral donors and also the multilaterals, China was offering debt relief as well. So from a borrower's perspective, it's not clear that bringing China around the table is going to get China to do more. No, not necessarily. It is doing plenty already. So what is the interest from a borrower's perspective of getting China specifically around the table with the other creditors? Balazs.
Let me answer that. When any creditor goes in and faces a country which says, sorry, I can't pay back your loan, the first thing that country wants, and the lender will want, okay, let me see your situation. So how much do you owe to this country? How much do you owe to that country? And what is the total? And can we get them all to the table? We have a broadly equitable solution, because each country that gives up debt service basically uses taxpayer money. Or
Well,
if it's a
so
private
the
corporation,
accountability-
then... So, no, I'm getting to a point. Please bear with me for
Sure.
10 more
Sure.
seconds. When they try to do this, they bump into a problem. China does not reveal the amount of debt that it has given. China does not reveal the terms of those debts, so the debt service cannot be calculated. And this blocks the other players from offering similar haircuts, similar concessions. And I think what would help from by bringing China in, actually China could unlock the other countries doing more if it agreed to revealing the amount, the terms and the amount. Does that answer your question?
what I'm concerned about with that answer, which I think, has a rationale, is that is an excuse. Because as a creditor, the issue around whether one of your lending partners is unable to pay back is to do with your own ability as well to manage that. So you need to look at your own portfolio. Do we have too much risk with this debtor? Have we overinvested in this debtor versus others who are paying up their debts? And if you have overinvested, then of course there's an issue, and so you then need to put a lot of resource into working with that borrower, etc. But there is no evidence whatsoever that the multilateral system, Eurobonds, or others are overinvesting in African nations, for instance. They're not overinvesting in Zambia. If anything, they're underinvesting. Zambia needs a lot more finance for infrastructure, way more concessional loans than it's been able to get. There's, so many projects constantly put through, being requested in the multilateral system, and they don't get enough finance. So from a creditor's perspective too, why insist on your borrower having to be open? The accountability for public finance is clearly for citizens. You're absolutely right, Balázs. This is taxpayers' money. They need to know where the finance is going, and they need to know what assets it's building, how much the government, what the opportunity costs of paying debt are in terms of services, health, education, etc. But is that really the creditor's business? Not necessarily. Creditors should be managing their risk. They should be managing their own risk.
Of course they should. Of course they should. I fully agree. But let me just say, no creditor wants to give much better terms in a rescheduling than everybody else. And what I'm saying is that as long as they don't know what terms the others are giving. And I have to say, in the instances that I got some insight on how much haircut the Chinese side was willing to accept, it was actually quite generous. So you're right in that. But it did not reveal how much it is. And you talked about excuses. I think it is an excuse for some creditors. They will say, no, we won't give in because we don't know whether we would be giving the best terms or not. I think transparency would benefit everyone, including the creditors and the lenders and the borrowers.
So the Chinese perspective, the reason the Chinese government, at least that's from the discussions I've had with Chinese government officials and others, is if a country would like to share information about its overall debt with regards to including Chinese contracts, if they have, for instance, a clause in terms of parliamentary approval, parliamentary disclosure, it will follow those rules. Those are the rules that need to be followed. That's the Chinese perspective. But China will not demand more than the citizens demand, because the government is accountable to its citizens. So as a creditor, China will not do that. However, other creditors, seem that they will do that, and they want to do that, and that's completely fine for them. So it's a different approach. It's a very different approach, and I in terms of accountability, I think what is way more important is for citizens to understand what's happening. But I don't think China is a break on that. It is government's decisions to do that. You take a country like Cameroon, for instance. There was a report which was issued, looking at Chinese contracts, Chinese loans recently. And a country like Cameroon has legislation which says we will publish contracts. So that information was accessible. That's not to do with Chinese secrecy. It's a government's decision. So when we look at these issues, I think painting China as a bogey man is almost, or bogey country is kind of the easy way out for many creditors. But I think creditors can be responsible. Creditors can be more thoughtful with regards to how they help countries avoid the kinds of bankruptcy issues that you were talking about, avoid vulture funds. Have we seen legislation being passed recently from the UK and US as financial centers to avoid vulture funds? Because that had to happen in the 2000s, in the 1990s. Has that been passed yet? Many of these things, we know they're coming. We've seen this. We've been in this situation at the beginnings of this situations before. And I'm concerned that we are looking at the wrong issues at the moment.
So let me just be very, very clear. I'm not painting China as the bogeyman. I do think China
I wasn't saying you were.
Important.
I wasn't saying
yeah.
you were.
All I pointed out was the externalities that one creditor has on another, which can be minimized if there is full transparency on who gave what and on what terms. Otherwise, sure, you're right.
So, I'm kind of cognizant of that I don't want us to run out of time. And I'd like to move the conversation slightly more looking to the future. So, as both of you mentioned, in a lot of ways, the COVID crisis is nested into the climate crisis, and it's also a kind of a trial run almost for all of for trying to start thinking thinking about kind of mechanisms to mitigate that much bigger, more complicated crisis. So, from a question from our audience, from Christoph Nedepel, I was wondering, from both of you, whether you see potential to apply debt for climate and debt for nature swaps, or alternatively debt restructuring through nature performance loans to deal with the debt. Is there a way for us to structure this kind of financing in a way that also kind of has a kind of climate payoff at the same time? Hannah, do you want to take that, and then Balázs can jump in?
Yeah, so there've been debt for nature swaps in the past, fairly limited, although they are existing. There's been a lot of work on this as well, from a number of think tanks and organizations. UN has also been involved. UNESCO and others have really tried to work on different types of debt for X swaps. I think they could be a useful instrument. I think, however, what I would encourage is perhaps a broader thinking about the debt system before we get to the debt for nature swap. So I think, and kind of again coming back to that point from the audience about looking at the failures of transnational multilateral systems in this crisis, we have had a debt crisis before. That was in the 1980s and 1990s, and that was nothing to do with the low-income countries that suffered the most, including in African countries. This was to do with a huge increase in interest rates due to the oil crisis. And so what we need to do is make sure that we avoid those failures. I think there's two ways that we can do that. And I don't know that a debt for nature swap necessarily gets to avoiding those failures. First of all, we need to rethink what debt crisis really means. Many countries are in serious need of more financing. It's not that they don't have enough finance, or it's not that they have too much finance. They have too little finance in order to deal with and to meet SDGs. In Africa, the entire financing gap, external financing gap, estimated at least 68 billion a year in terms of infrastructure finance. That's not even taking into account the new educational digital financing, that we need coming out of COVID-19. So that's number one. Countries need more finance. So how a debt for nature swap implies, or debt for climate swap implies, that you're sitting within the existing pot of debt. Well, somehow the existing pot of debt needs to somehow get much bigger. So that's number one. And yeah, we haven't even taken into account climate change financing needs there either. Second, that could be, for instance, one of the ways of doing that could be to look more at the asset base of countries, and to be looking at what is the existing debt building in terms of assets, how is it contributing to economic growth, rather than only looking at what are the risks associated with the debt carrying capacity of a country, looking much more broadly at these questions. So that's number one. Number two is that while, yes, there is a fiscal crisis, while there is while countries are unable to meet specific spending right now, that doesn't mean we have to get to a debt crisis. If more finance is extended now, cheap concessional finance is extended quickly, that could also make a huge difference and could really help countries. Again, would a debt for nature swap, with the kind of detailed negotiation that it requires? I mean, even, I know Balázs was saying IMF did find a way of creating more funds and so on, to compensate for not being able to, for not just providing a debt moratorium. What that meant is countries needed to go through a process of applying to the funds. They needed to also then go through questions of their debt sustainability and so on. It comes with a degree of conditionality. Yes, I know the conditionality was a lot lower for COVID-19, appreciated. But debt for climate swaps may include more conditionality. So that would be a real issue. Again, learning from what happened in the 1980s and 1990s, conditionality was a real challenge for many countries. Reliance on private sector privatization was a real challenge for many countries in terms of meeting poverty goals. So these are, I would say, yes, we should look at these options, but let's also look at others, including what I mentioned in terms of the borrowing club as well.
So my answer will have exactly the same structure as Hannah's. I also agree that there is a role that for climate, that for nature swaps can play. But these swaps inherently have a very small base. You have to have pre-existing loans in a bilateral basis where there is a country on the other end that is willing to consider these. And when you try to mix more than one country, the transactions costs, which are already high on these things, just go up exponentially. So I would say that they have a limited role, and wherever they can work, it's fantastic. Typically, they are in the range of $10 to $40 million, and they are not going to turn around a debt distress situation. Performance bonds have a slightly broader applicability. They are rather new. At the heart of performance bonds is whether you have the timely, policy relevant, publicly available data that is necessary to monitor whether those performance aspects are met or not met, and you are able to document it in a way that parties which have opposing interests both sign up to it. And that is not always easy. Let me now come, as I promised, the same structure as Hannah's. Let me come to other possible ways in which the underlying problem can be addressed. And actually it goes beyond that. What you need is fiscal space. And debt is just one way of creating fiscal space. And I would refer to rule number 1 of crisis management, which is if you find yourself in a hole, first stop digging. And in this particular aspect, there are government expenditures and there are unutilized government revenues, which mean that countries are digging a hole for themselves. And let me now link this to the climate change that you have mentioned, Kobus. In terms of climate change, you want a sustainable recovery, then you would want to have carbon pricing set right. Get rid of fossil fuel subsidies, auction off emission permits for large immobile emitters, and then from the price signal that comes from these auctions, set a tax level for mobile small emitters, which in aggregate are still very big, so that they pay a carbon tax. And at this point, everyone gets really nervous. Oh, that's what happened in France, and this is what happened in Ecuador and a number of other countries where this was done, and there was a huge backlash on the social side. But just think for a moment, what you have when you no longer spend on fossil fuel subsidies is money in the hand of government. What you have when you auction off a correctly calibrated amount of emission permits is money in the hand of government, and what you have when you impose a carbon tax is again money in the hands of government. If that is taken out of the economy, you have just engineered a gigantic economic crisis. However, you can feed it back, and you can feed it back into the economy in a way that addresses the debt service problems, that addresses the social problems that are created, that addresses the income effect for the poor, 1/2 of the population, and you still have money left over. And in this case, what you have is you have set incentives right, and not only have you begun to finance the gap that you need for a green transition, you have actually reduced the size of the debt, or you will reduce over time, because both supply and demand will react to the new relative prices. So the supply of renewables will be much bigger, and the demand for fossil fuels will be much smaller. So just by changing relative prices, you actually act on the size of the problem that you have when you are thinking about addressing climate change. And, a very important and, you have not created debt. If you just reduce unproductive expenditures and you increase some taxes, which then you recycle into the economy so you don't cause a crash, and you do it in a way that you address the social problems, then you have changed relative prices so that there is a smaller problem to finance. I hope that makes sense. Over to you.
This has been such an incredible conversation. It's like so fascinating. I wish we could go on for 3 more hours. But like unfortunately we have run out of time. So I just wanted to thank the speakers and thanking GRASFI as well for just giving us this chance to have this conversation. And I hope too that we'll be able to kind of take this conversation forward on other platforms as well. So I just wanted again to thank the speakers. You were both incredible. It was really fun to speak with you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks so much.
Thank you so much.
Have a great day. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Balázs, it was so fun.
Have been muted.
Yeah, for both of you.